This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Streaming across Bloomberg platforms, live on TV and radio, and of course on YouTube. This is Bloomberg Business Week for a very, very busy Monday. We are getting ready to wrap up the third quarter. Just one more trading day. We've got our eyes, though, big time on the nation's capital today, Tim.
Yeah, we're waiting a press conference set to start imminently from the White House. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with President Trump. That was actually set for a little less than an hour ago, but about an hour ago. So we are awaiting these two. We will bring you that press conference live, Carol, as it begins.
Some say it's a sign of these difficult talks of trying to figure out how to put an end to the war between Israel and Hamas. All right, having said that, we've got a lot going on this week when it comes to the U.S. economy, on the future of Gaza, and on a possible government shutdown. So all of that ahead this hour, including we're going to take a look at President Trump, a key figure in his administration, in a possible government budget impasse and what it may mean for the power of the federal purse.
Also, the race for space telecom with the president of AST Space Mobile. That's coming up a little later in our program.
All right, we've got stocks hovering near their lows of this session. Bit of a mixed market here on this Monday. A lot coming at investors throughout the week. Let's get a check on it. In for Charlie Pellet is Alexis Christoforous. She joins us now. Hey, Alexis.
Hey, Carol, thanks very much. Yeah, the market keeping its eye on this possible government shutdown. As you said, stocks are mixed right now. Tech stocks, though, continue to be the stars. So let's break it down. The Dow Industrials down about 23 points. We've got the S&P 500 up 11, but the NASDAQ Composite rallying 105. Yields coming under a little pressure. The 10-year yield 4.13%, 2-year at 3.62%. Another record day for gold. It is now trading at around $38.30 an ounce. In stock news, Electronic Arts rallying more than 4.5% after the video game maker agreed to the largest leveraged buyout of all time, selling to a group of private investors led by Silver Lake and Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. Also want to shine a spotlight on NVIDIA. We know it had a tough go of it last week. The stock bouncing back, though, today. It is up now better than 2% as the AI trade seems to be back on. And Lufthansa planning to cut 4,000 jobs by 2030 to improve profitability. This is the largest round of job cuts at the company, at Europe's largest airline since the pandemic. Lufthansa says the majority of those cuts will be occurring in Germany. Checking ADRs traded here in the U.S. of Lufthansa, they are just about flat. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alexis Christoforous. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Back over to Carol and Tim.
All right, Alexis, thank you so much. Well, as we mentioned, a lot coming at investors this week. We're going to keep a watch on the White House as we do expect President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to make some comments. So as soon as they begin speaking, we'll take you there live. In the meantime, it's a big week for the U.S. economy, folks, because we've got the monthly jobs report on the docket. Or is it? Because maybe not, Tim.
As a shutdown of the U.S. government could stop economic releases and make for a foggy U.S. economy, and perhaps one that's even foggier, which may just make all of our jobs trickier. Fortunately, we've got Stuart Paul with us. He's Bloomberg Economics U.S. and Canada economist. He joins us here in the studio. They will suspend all operations, that's a quote, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and cease all active data collection activity should the federal government shut down. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for us?
Well, it makes for a lighter work schedule for me, less data to react to and less data to forecast. What's interesting is that in the absence of this federal data, all eyes are going to be on the data sets that we're not getting from the BLS. So the ADP data, for example, carries all the more importance because we're not getting it from the federal government, we're getting it from ADP. If that's the insight that we have into the labor market, if that's the data that's available to the Fed to make their decisions, we're going to need to rely on those alternative data sets. But what does it mean for me from an economic perspective? What do we know about government shutdowns more broadly? Well, for each week that the government is shut down, that typically shaves off about a 0.25 percentage point from the annualized pace of GDP growth during the quarter. So if we're shut down for 4 weeks, that shaves off a full percentage point from fourth quarter growth. there's a rebound effect in the subsequent quarter, typically. What's a little bit tricky is that this is happening right at the beginning of the fourth quarter. So if we were to have a 3-week shutdown, which is about the longest shutdown we've ever seen, we would still have plenty of time in the fourth quarter to make up those losses. And it could just end up being a wash when we finally do get data releases when everybody returns to work.
All right. So if it's a short shutdown, if it's 3 weeks, well, we're going to kind of be okay. We're just going to kind of figure our way through.
That's right. Yeah, I think that everything's going to be okay. I think that folks who are furloughed are going to go to the all-day happy hours around DuPont Circle. I think that it's going to be tense negotiations. But I do want to keep in mind that a 3-week shutdown is a pretty long shutdown. In the context of the quarter, though, it's not that big of a deal. What is a little bit tricky is that the Fed would be, in a sense, driving blind because it doesn't have the official statistics that it really prefers to use and the data that it likes to refer to for communications policy, right? It's always referring to its preferred inflation gauge, the core PCE measure. It's always referring to the unemployment rate to talk about the balance of labor supply and labor demand. If we don't have those statistics, official communications becomes difficult. But in terms of actual economic activity, in terms of actually knowing where we are within the business cycle, for example, even a 3-week shutdown is relatively brief.
Is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Labor Department, or Commerce, I'm thinking about the data that goes into all of the monthly jobs reports, are they at risk of losing employees, though, in a government shutdown? There is some concern that if there is a shutdown, it kind of emboldens the executive branch to maybe make more cuts, mass firings. There's certainly been some warnings along that line.
Yeah, so it's definitely possible. The Department of Labor has about 13,000 employees on its payrolls. In the event of a shutdown, that ends up getting pared back to about 3,000 employees, only one of whom, according to the Department of Labor's contingency plan, only one of those employees would remain at work in the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Wow.
So in terms of data collection, it's going to be a major problem. We could end up seeing some pretty choppy labor surveys, especially for October if the shutdown continues through the reference week, the week containing the 12th of the month. Could be very choppy. And if we were to see, as Carol said, en masse firings, as President Trump has threatened, that would materially result in a reduction in the number of folks on government payrolls and perhaps an increase in the unemployment rate up to 4.5%.
But what about, can I just, to follow, but if we lose people at the Labor Department, I mean, in terms of the data collection, that's at risk too.
Absolutely. So it's really going to be a matter of what data collection looks like through the reference week, and as many issues as we've had with data quality and estimating nationwide aggregates from the surveys that are sent out every month. It's going to be problematic, and we're likely going to end up seeing, again, revisions that have been so frustrating.
You know, it's funny. Sometimes the ADP report is similar to what we get from the BLS. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people say, don't pay attention to it. Sometimes they say, do pay attention to it. Why is that? I mean, there's no clear indication that this source of alternative data is one we should read into.
Well, so ADP, of course, reads from actual payrolls for the firms that are using ADP for payroll processing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics asks companies how many people are on their payrolls. So there are different methodologies for collecting the data. You also have a selection problem. Which are the firms that are going to be using ADP? They might be larger firms that have the budget to do back office instead of having just one person who's responding to surveys, for example. So we have different methodology and collection issues there. But one thing that I would point out is that if you look at private non-farm payrolls as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics after adjusting for all the revisions, it looks much more similar to ADP than it did before the revisions going back several months. So we are getting more of a coherent narrative across the two data sets. And the bottom line is, look, if we don't have the Bureau of Labor Statistics data at our fingertips, we're going to look at what we have, which would be ADP.
What about if we have Lisa Cook ultimately gets fired from her job? And that's another thing we're keeping an eye on this week. That's a bigger deal.
That would be a bigger deal because, again, it's just the politicization of monetary policy. Matters less for the collection of data, knowing where we are in the business cycle, even though it would be one fewer person on government payrolls. But that's a different sort of firing than we're thinking about when we talk about government furloughs. Yeah.
Is there a chance that if we don't get numbers this week for September, payrolls report is what I'm talking about, and the government is shut down for a month, we never see those September numbers? Or is it there's a bigger chance that we never see October numbers because the data collection for October, the numbers that we'll get in November, that data collection could occur when the government is closed?
We would get the data when furloughed workers come back to the office. So data that are put on hold or data that are data releases that are just not released during the furlough window, during the lapse, as it's called in the contingency plan, would end up being released at a later date. The data collection issues, it's very difficult to make those up. You move out of the survey window, you move on with your life and start collecting the November data. So just the data quality for the October release would be more problematic.
All right, we're talking with Stuart Paul, U.S. and Canada economist for Bloomberg Economics, here in our Bloomberg studio at Bloomberg headquarters. In the meantime, both Tim and I, with one eye on what's going on in the nation's capital, we are expecting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to step up to the podiums. There are two already set, as you who are watching on TV and YouTube, those on radio. There are two podiums. No one has stepped up yet, but we do see reporters and other officials mulling around, sitting down as they await those leaders to enter. The two have been meeting, holding bilateral talks. We also have on the Bloomberg a story that crossed just before we came on air that President Trump, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Qatar's Prime Minister discussing a proposal for ending the war in Gaza in a trilateral phone call. That's according to a statement posted by the White House.
I'm looking at a press release, too, coming from the White House. The White House has put out its 20-point plan, called a comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the proposal says that within 72 hours of Israel publicly accepting this agreement, all hostages, alive and deceased, will be returned. Once all hostages are released, Israel will release 250 life sentence prisoners plus 1,700 Gazans who were detained after October 7th, 2023, including all women and children detained in that context. Carol, the first point on this is Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors, and it will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza who have suffered more than enough. Once again, just a few of the 20 points that the White House has released for its comprehensive plan. That's what it calls it, to end the Gaza conflict.
As we wait to go to D.C., our thanks to Stuart Paul, as we said, of our Bloomberg Economics team. Right now, we want to go to another member of the Bloomberg News team, Bloomberg News Middle East Geoeconomics lead, Dina Esfandiary. She is joining us from Switzerland. Dina, we're starting to get some details on this 20-point plan. What's your read on the news flow as we get it? And we were waiting, of course, these leaders to speak.
Of course. Look, I think if the plan gets accepted, it's a good first start. But really, it's an uphill battle from there because you would need Hamas to buy into it. Remember that this was only President Trump's effort to sell it to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Then they're going to have to sell it to Hamas and get them on board, although they've got some echoes that might work from the Arab states who saw the plan last week at UNGA, at the UN General Assembly. And then, of course, you'd have to implement it. And the implementation at the beginning is going to go very quickly with the release of those hostages in, I think, 72 hours is what you mentioned earlier. And of course, you're going to have a drawdown of the Israeli presence in Gaza. And I think that's going to be a real sticking point down the line.
What does it mean that Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza who have suffered more than enough? This is the second point in that 20-point plan that was released by the White House.
Well, that's a good question. It's very vague. It's very unclear. For now, we have some brief commitments on the part of some Arab states and the Europeans to provide some funding for the rebuilding of Gaza. But the main issue that you're going to have there is that you're not going to want to rebuild Gaza just for it to get destroyed 2 months, 6 months, 1 year down the line. So you're going to have to make sure that this ceasefire really sticks before people start pouring money into rebuilding the Strip.
What makes it stick, and what's the U.S.'s role in making it stick?
Well, again, that's a very good question. I think the Americans are the only one that have enough influence to pull the levers to ensure that Israel sticks to its end of the bargain. And a couple of the Arab states are going to be the ones to make sure that Hamas sticks to its end of the bargain. But for Hamas, once you have this promise of Israeli drawdown from the Strip and a semblance of Palestinian governance set up for the Strip, then they will have an incentive to stick to it. They may release the hostages, and you may start to get the beginnings of a ceasefire that actually sticks. But like I said, there are so many hurdles down the line that I'm not very optimistic.
Well, but there are different things, and I'm not sure if it's a hurdle. Do you call this a hurdle that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu called Qatar's Prime Minister to apologize for that missile strike that targeted Hamas figures in Doha? We saw that Israeli jet strike on a residential compound in the Qatari capital, killing 5 Hamas officials and a security guard, and that did set back talks to end the war in Gaza. That apology, is that a significant hurdle?
Well, that's definitely a hurdle that was overcome, and that's definitely good news. It shows that President Trump was willing to use a little bit of muscle in order to ensure that Netanyahu apologized. Now, of course, that doesn't erase what happened. There were several red lines that were crossed on that day, but it definitely goes some way towards reassuring the Gulf Arab states, reassuring Qatar that this kind of thing won't happen again.
Dina, I'm looking through this 20-point plan that was released as we're speaking, because we're just getting some details now. The 9th point is that Gaza will be governed under the temporary transitional governance of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee responsible for delivering the day-to-day running of public services and municipalities for the people in Gaza. It will be made up of qualified Palestinian and international experts, and there will be a board of peace, which will be headed and chaired by President Donald J. Trump, with other members and heads of state to be announced, including Prime Minister Tony Blair. In your view, in your analysis, what are the chances that they would agree to this?
It's possible that Hamas will agree to it. What becomes more difficult again is the very implementation of that cause. I think there's a lot of goodwill that goes into putting these things down on paper. I think the Trump administration does want to resolve this crisis. The Arab states do want to put in place a framework for resolving this crisis and at least maintaining the ceasefire once it's been agreed to. But the problem is the Palestinian political space has been one that's just fraught with problems, fraught with corruption, with the ineffectiveness of the Palestinian Authority. And so all of these things, again, are going to be impediments to the implementation of this. Yes, we have former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who's indicated that he's willing to help chair this committee, to bring everybody together to do it. But goodwill in the actual implementation is not the same.
So what's interesting, too, is, and I'm not sure, I'm reading through this kind of quickly, I don't see anything, and Tim, correct me if you've seen this, about the creation of a Palestinian state, which we have seen, something like 140 global leaders in support of. I also am reading number 12 of this 20-point plan, no one will be forced to leave Gaza. Does that mean that there will continue to be Israeli settlements in Gaza?
So the main issue that you're going to have is that President Trump has said that they want to stop Israeli annexation and settlement activity, and in Gaza, in the West Bank especially, but just generally. That's going to be a problem for the Israeli Prime Minister, given some of the backing of the hardline ministers that he has domestically. And I'm not sure they've managed to square that circle. What comes next? So he agrees to that, but his ministers are not on board because they've made it very clear that actually settlements in the West Bank, settlements in Gaza is exactly what's going to follow. They believe in Israeli governance in a place like Gaza. And of course, that's a problem for the Palestinians.
Dina, who are the leaders that the U.S. and Israel need to negotiate with on behalf of Hamas, given that Israel said it has wanted to take out the leaders of Hamas? Who are the people left that will negotiate this?
Well, you've had that close and small circle of Hamas negotiators increasingly shrink. Each of their political leadership has been targeted in the past. Now, in the attacks on Doha, they weren't able to get anybody high level, just some lower level Hamas officials. So the current negotiating team remains intact, as it were. And it will be down to the Qataris and the Egyptians to pass on those messages once Prime Minister Netanyahu has agreed to the deal to Hamas, to pass the deal to Hamas and coax them into joining onto it.
So specifically, who speaks for Palestine? Is it Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian National Authority? And just curious too, Dina, with which body will this deal be presented in which Hamas has no future as an organization?
So again, you raise a major issue there. They are negotiating with Hamas. Hamas would have to concede that it would put down its weapons. It would have to concede that it wouldn't have a role in the future of the Palestinian state. And who are we left with? You mentioned the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. Yes, he would be one person, but he's not well liked. Again, his government and those that are around him are known for being ineffective, for being corrupt. And so you would have to look for new leaders within the Palestinian political system. There are several that you can turn to, but for those that are the most popular, they're either in Israeli jails or not ready to run at the moment. So you find yourself at a really difficult point where you don't really have political leaders that you can turn to.
And I should point out number 16 of this 20-point plan that has been put out. And this is, again, I believe, coming from the White House, President Trump's comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. This as we await President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu expected to make some comments from the White House. We're monitoring that. But there is a note that I just lost it. Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. So it does look like that they will be pulling out completely. But again, we're going to get some more color and commentary and specifics as soon as we hear from these leaders.
But Dina, can you imagine a world, to Carol's point, in which the Israeli Defense Forces, in which the IDF does not occupy or annex Gaza, and the Israeli government would be comfortable with that after what happened 2 years ago?
Can I imagine a world? Yes, but I think that would be a world in which the Trump administration or whatever U.S. administration is in place would really have to use a significant amount of muscle, would have to leverage their influence over the Israelis to secure that Israeli buy-in for something like that. At the moment, I don't see that playing out, and we'll see what happens at the press conference shortly. Maybe Trump did. But up until now, he certainly hasn't displayed the will to use enough muscle to get Israel to the table in a manner that would, ensure that a ceasefire like this stuck.
So what is that leverage that the U.S. has over Israel? What power does the U.S. have to say, okay, well, this is what we're pushing for. We need Israel to follow these rules. What would the U.S. do?
Well, the two countries, Israel is a major ally of the U.S.'s. It depends on American funding. It depends on American weapons. Even fighting this war in Gaza is highly dependent on U.S. weapons and military assistance. Its ability to defend itself against Hamas, importantly against Hamas supporters like Iran, for example, that's also dependent on the United States. So the U.S. would be able to leverage things like funding, things like military assistance, in order to really ensure that the Israelis buy into such a project. But that would create a lot of problems domestically for Netanyahu and for some of the hardline elements of his government.
I do want to point out, and Sebastian Escobar, thank you so much, one of our producers here, pointing out number 19 of the 20-point plan that has come down from the White House. And President Trump says specifically, while Gaza redevelopment advances and when the PA reform program is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which we recognize as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. One thing I want to ask you, Dina, both leaders, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, understand the optics of what they say and do here. Just different constituents, if you will, in all of this globally. One of the things I was listening to our Balance of Power team, Joe Matthew and Tyler Kendall, is one of their observers saying that it's a few weeks away from the Nobel Peace Prize being announced. Is that a factor? We know that President Trump would certainly like to be nominated and actually get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Of course, that's a factor. What's also another one is that President Trump has campaigned on the promise to end forever wars. And this has been a war that's been raging on for many decades now, obviously intensified in the last 2 years. It doesn't help American reputation and, of course, by extension, Israel's reputation in the region. It's just draining his administration's bandwidth and time and resources. And it's difficult for him to turn around and say he's a president of peace while this war rages on. So it's absolutely critical for the Trump administration to resolve this crisis.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Dina, thank you so much. Always appreciate your insight. Dina Esfandiary, she is, of course, Bloomberg News Middle East Geoeconomics lead, joining us from Geneva, Switzerland, where it's a little bit later in the evening over there. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. We are awaiting comments from President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expected from the White House. For those who are watching on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals and Bloomberg TV, you can see certainly 2 empty podiums, but a pretty busy and stacked room. Folks, reporters and various administration officials there in the room awaiting comments. This after a bilateral meeting and lunch between the two officials. And as a result, we have gotten from the White House and the president, Tim, a comprehensive plan is what it's being called to end the Gaza conflict with 20 points. Yeah,
the White House releasing this 20-point plan just in the last half hour designed to end the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza following that meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today. The plan stipulates that the conflict would end immediately if accepted by both Israel and Hamas, and that all hostages and the remains of those who died would be returned within 72 hours. The agreement would also see Israel release close to 2,000 prisoners and stipulates that Israel would not occupy or annex Gaza. The proposal, Carol, also encourages Gaza residents to remain in place, pledges the immediate resumption of aid, and says a, quote, panel of experts would be convened to rebuild and energize the war-torn area with economic development.
So it's really interesting to get the specificity, and it'll be interesting in terms of who has signed on from Hamas. This is crucial. Ceasefire officially, if indeed we get this. And it seems to be laying out all of the specific points. But we are waiting to hear from these two leaders to see whether or not this is finally an end to this war that is just getting ready to enter its 3rd year. So it would be certainly a big deal. And as we heard from our Bloomberg colleague, Dina Esfandiary, that this was certainly a key part of President Trump's campaign, planning to end this war and bring peace certainly between Israel and Hamas. So this would certainly be a key accomplishment if indeed that is what we get when we hear those two leaders step up to the podium.
Certainly a plan is one thing, but it's unclear if Hamas will also sign on to these terms, even as the war nears its 2-year mark. The militant group sparked the war with the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. And they said ahead of the Trump-Netanyahu meeting that it has yet to see the plan and would need to study the proposal. I do think it's notable, Carol, that it is Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, but there are other parties who are required to sign on to this that are not present at today's press conference.
No Palestinian leader or someone speaking for the Palestinian people. So we do want to head to the White House, President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.